All right, folks, President Barack Obama was in Atlanta yesterday attending a prescription drug and heroin summit. The president there promised $1.6 billion to fund combating the issue over the next couple of years. Yesterday, during the visit, they talked about a variety of issues, and he also took part in a panel to discuss the growing problem of opiate and heroin abuse. Obama listened as two folks on the panel opened up about their addiction to heroin and prescription drugs. He then had this to say.
The problem we have right now is that treatment is greatly underfunded. And you know, it's particularly underfunded in a lot of rural areas. Our task force, when we were looking at it, figured out that in about 85% of counties in America, there are just a handful or no mental health and drug treatment facilities that are easily accessible for the populations there. So if you get a situation in which somebody's in pain initially because of a disc problem, they may not have health insurance because maybe the governor didn't expand Medicaid like they should have under the ACA. They go to a doctor one time when the pain gets too bad. The doctor's prescribing painkillers. They run out, and it turns out it's cheaper to get heroin on the street than it is to try to figure out how to refill that prescription.
All right, folks, prescription opioid and heroin abuse claims the lives of tens of thousands of Americans each year. The tax dollars President Obama plans to use will fund agreements with the states to expand medication-assisted treatment. Joining us on Skype from New York is Cassandra Frederick, State Director for the New York Drug Policy Alliance, and of course, still on our panel, Ralph Chitums, Lauren Victoria Burke, David Swirlick. I got to say this here, when you talk about this drug panel, when you talk about this conversation here, and look, we hear all the time from our audience, and that is all of a sudden, because whites are all of a sudden being impacted by prescription drug use, by heroin, now it's a national conversation. Now it's about compassion. Now it's about treatment. When it was a black face and crack, all we heard was throw them in jail, Cassandra.
Yes. I mean, that's absolutely correct, Roland. I think what's really important for the audience to know is that most of the drug laws were created based on who was stereotypically associated with them. So the first drug laws in the United States were in San Francisco and had to do with Chinese migrants. And that's when we made opium illegal. Marijuana was because of Mexicans, and cocaine was made illegal because of free black porters. You know, before Richard Nixon even declared the war on drugs in 1971, a black man wrote a book called The Legislation of Morality, Troy Duster, who's at UC Berkeley, whose main thesis was that the face of the dominant user population will determine what the laws are associated with that drug and not the pharmacology. And he published that book in 1970. So this is not new. This is not something that happened in the last 40 years. This is basically how all our drug laws have been created, based on race.
And so the president goes to this particular summit, shedding light on this. And again, this really feeds into this whole narrative that if it doesn't affect white folks, then it's not real in America. And whether or not people say, well, you know, why you should bring that up, but it's just real. I mean, I literally listened to Governor Chris Christie and former Governor Jeb Bush talk about having family members and friends who had their lives destroyed by drug use. Yet when I think about the rhetoric of politicians, when these things are happening in black and brown communities, what I'm hearing is a law enforcement strategy, not a mental health or health care response.
Exactly. And I think part of the conversation, that is part of the conversation. When we're talking right now about a public health and safety approach to drug use, we also need to have a public health and safety approach to the failed drug policies that have happened. So I would love to hear the people like Chris Christie and Jeb Bush and President Barack Obama talk about decriminalizing drug use, trying to talk about how can we put more money into reentry? How do we reduce the role that law enforcement has in this conversation about drugs? So while I was really excited about them increasing resources for medication-assisted treatment, I was disappointed that we are still putting more money into drug task force. And that, for me, is the larger conversation. How do we get to a point where we're talking about that we're not only saying that, we need to increase resources for public health, we also need to increase the resources for public health in communities of color. Because let's be really clear, there is medication-assisted treatment, and when we're talking about products like buprenorphine, which the administration is going to increase, the current state of buprenorphine is woefully underserved in communities of color. I've seen reports that say 90% of buprenorphine patients right now are white. So even though that these resources, we're having large conversations about rural communities, we need to make sure that these resources also go to the people that have been most impacted, that for 40 years, for over 100 years, the main process for us to deal with these issues have been law enforcement instead of treatment.
I'm gonna go to our panel here. I mean, look, I'm just being honest, unlike some folks, and I'm gonna call this what this is. This is a white drug problem.
Well, I'm going to be even more honest. And so put on your seatbelt, because I'm going to say something you probably never expected a Republican to say. If this is what they're going to do and treat drug addiction as a health issue, then they should release from prison every nonviolent drug offender who's currently incarcerated and get them into treatment. Because if it's a health issue in Hartford, it's a health issue in Harlem.
Now, that's an interesting one, because this president is way behind on pardons and commutations. So you're absolutely right. If they were really serious, he would let some people out there in now who are addicted to drugs, but they're not serious. This $1.6 billion is fantasy land. Yes. Congress has to appropriate that. So if the president really wanted to have a conversation about this, he would actually talk to DOJ and his prosecutors about the way they prosecute these crimes, and not do these sort of press events that they do, where if we follow this up, particularly with regard to the money, we're going to find that doesn't actually get allocated.
But also, to me, David, not just talk to federal prosecutors, but to literally convene local DAs and states attorney generals and say, I also need you guys to follow this method in the local and state level. David, then Cassandra.
Right. The president is the president of everybody, so it's fine for him to address it if it's now become a problem in white communities, if it's or become a greater problem in white communities or rural communities, as he said. But then he's got to speak and comprehensively deal with it, state, local, federal level, and through all communities of color.
Well, he's in charge of the federal system, though. I mean, the president is in charge of the federal system.
But as Roland's saying, let's address it comprehensively, or don't just address it selectively.
Cassandra, go ahead.
And I'd actually add that, the district attorneys around this country have been one of the biggest forces of pushing forward the drug war. And we really need to have a conversation about how prosecution and district attorneys play into the way that the war on drugs has been disseminated throughout communities. And I would actually even push back further than what David was talking about nonviolent offenders. I think we need to have a real conversation about the role that criminalization plays, and even the really fake and sometimes arbitrary distinction between violent and nonviolent. If we're trying to talk about a public health and safety approach to the drug problem, and we're looking at the incarceration rates, especially in communities of color, then we need to have a larger conversation about why those distinctions are so important.
But Cassandra, why isn't your group pushing the president and the White House on pardons and computations? I mean,
I don't know.
The point was very well made with regard to pardons and computations. We have people in the system right now with regard to crack powder that are in the system right now that we should be pushing to get out.
Cassandra, your response.
I would say that I think that it's really important for you to have all the information. DPA has been one of the biggest organizations talking about pardons and clemencies. Someone that I work with every day spent 12 years in Sing Sing prison in New York under the Rockefeller drug laws, and has been one of the first people getting clemency and pardons for fighting for that across the country. We've been working with groups like Free, working with groups like Just Leadership, working with groups like A New Path, having conversations with TOPS, having a conversation with different advocates across the country talking about pardons.
But why isn't Drug Policy Alliance pushing the White House on computations?
We are having those.
Which he is way behind.
Okay, 1 second, go ahead.
We are having those conversations. It's in our press release. We talk about it. Bill Piper, Michael Collins, Grant Smith, all in our Office of National Affairs are having daily conversations about those issues. And we can't do it alone. It can't just be us. We're already building the ground game at Drug Policy Alliance.
Okay. Cassandra, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Can't do it alone.
Thank you.
All right, folks, find out what still drives the R&B group SWV to keep making music and performing for their fans. Plus, we're bringing the funk in our Wilding Out segment. We always have a little fun with our comedians, and today will be no different. For the latest news, be sure to go to news1.com. You can also hit me up with your thoughts on Twitter at Roland S. Martin. You can also go hit us at News1. Visit our News One Facebook page. Visit mine. Now, remember, if you say some crazy stuff on Twitter and Facebook, you know I'm going to clap back on you. I'm just letting you know. 20 before top of the hour. News 1 9 TV 1.